Okay, we're starting chapter 11. We just got through with Paul's talking about the Jews being we had quotations from the book of Isaiah in the closing part of the 10th chapter that had to do with God admitting, opening up to Gentiles as his people, and the Jews refusing. And Paul applies those Isaiah passages to the situation at his time. He saw that as the Old Testament teaching that made his job as a special apostle to the Gentiles approved of by God. I've got a little frog in my throat, and okay. And then he says the Gentiles the Jews were stubborn. He said, all day long I have been extending my hands to you, a stubborn and disobedient people. You can read, I always think about the sermon of Stephen, and he rehearses the number of times that the Jewish people had rebelled against God. And he applies that to the rebellion against the Christ in his time. And Paul does the same thing. He said, he's told his kinsmen, the Jews, that you remember what Jesus himself said, it'll be better for Tyre and Sidon and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than it will be for you, because if the miracles that were done in you, Capernaum, Bethsaida, and so on, were done in them, they would have repented in sackcloth. So Paul is continuing that line of teaching, because here was the situation. The people of God, the ones he had selected and had been his chosen people, and still are for that matter, but up until this time, over 1,500 years. Now you subtract 1,500 years from 2014, and you've got what? 514. Most of you don't even know what was happening in 514.
That's probably true.
What?
She said that's probably true.
Yeah. Well, Europe was under the control of the barbarian rulers that had come from the east, the Goths, Visigoths, the Huns, the Vandals, the Celtics, the Celts, and all, and we're having a real hard time. But that length of time, and now God had just taught those Jews by allowing their country to be destroyed that there was only one God, and there's no sign that after the exile and the return that any Jew ever was worshipped an idol again. And lo and behold, what happens? Here is Jesus on an equality with God, divine. Now, if somebody had appeared among the Gentiles claiming to be the Son of God, it wouldn't have caused any upset at all. Alexander the Great, he claimed if he was the Son of God. One of the basic teachings of the Roman emperors were that they were sons and daughters of God. And that they used that, it helped them rule the empire. And so who was it? Somebody was born claiming to be divine. The last place you would expect it, in a Jewish setting. So don't feel superior to the Jews because you believe in Christ and many of them do not. They learned the hard way. And you have to let God decide that. None of our business. Do you hear me? To condemn.
There are parallels in the marriage relationship from Adam and Eve to God and Israel and Jesus and his bride, the church.
Uh-huh.
And the relationship between God and his people is between him and his people.
Yes. And so this is what Paul is dealing with. See, Paul was in a difficult place. He wanted his fellow Jews to be included in belief in the Messiah. He even went so far as to say, if it would help, I would be lost.
That's why they went back to Jerusalem in the first place.
Yeah.
Everybody told not to.
Yeah. So, okay. That's the reason the question that opens the 11th chapter is so important. I ask, therefore, did God repudiate his people? Now, that is what the Jewish leaders, at least, accused Paul of teaching. That God had repudiated his people and put Gentiles in their place. Now, we're going to see that there's an element of truth in that, but not in the way that they were accusing him of teaching.
What does repudiate mean?
What?
Repudiate exactly mean?
Reject what?
Reject, yes. To repudiate somebody means that you had some kind of relationship with them and you said no longer. That is, to get right down what he's talking about, that the Jews no longer were acceptable to God. That's it.
Charles, the back end of that second verse, whom he foreknew, is how it's translated here in the NIV.
Yeah.
Is that the same word as is sometimes predestined?
Well, it's not the same word, but it's the same idea. For those he foreknew, he predestined, Paul is going to say. I believe it's in Ephesians. In that. See, to foreknow is that he knows something before it happens.
Right.
To predestine is he causes something to happen. And both of those things, while they're different actions on God's part, are important here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking about, I mean, predestined, can get into a lot of different conversations, based on the few places in Ephesians and Romans where we see that term used.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people have taken that to mean that God literally has chosen this individual to be saved and chosen this individual to be lost.
Okay, all right. By the way, Paul is not dealing with individual salvation here. Do you remember when we started this section, I made that emphasis. He's dealing with the overall plan or story of God. And individuals are not on the, except incidentally, they're not on stage here.
When a child disobeys the parent does not reject them, even though the child thinks that they may be rejected. They discipline them, and they show them, tough love sometimes. But that doesn't mean that because they were punished, that they were rejected.
Yeah. Now, see, even back in the Old Testament, God is quoted, and again, I believe it's in Isaiah. It's either Isaiah or Jeremiah. I get the two mixed up sometimes. That the Jews were saying, "You've forsaken us," and he said, "Does a mother forget the babe at her breast?" And he says, "Your name is written on my hand. I will not forget you or forsake you." So regardless of how much punishment he had sent to them, Paul is saying the same thing here. God has not repudiated them. He's not rejected them. In fact, the rejection is on the other foot. It is, they have rejected God. Now keep that in mind. God has not repudiated his people whom he foreknew. Now, that is, God understood from before the foundation of the world what the overall history of humankind would be. Now, if he wanted to know each individual person, he could. There is not anything in both the New and the Old Testament that says he does individually. Now, he probably does, but you would be hard pressed. The quotations of scriptures when somebody says, "Well, I have my plans for you," that's in Isaiah. I've heard it, so he has a plan for your life.
He knows the number of hairs on our head.
Yeah.
He probably knows a little more than that.
Yeah, well,
But
yes,
the way he acts is not necessarily individually.
yeah, but let me get finished with my saying, and if I can remember what the train of thought was. Yes, the Jeremiah passage, he is not talking about individual human beings. He is talking of the you there are the Jews, the people of God.
It's you all.
Yeah, you all.
Y'all.
Yeah, y'all. I'll tell you what, it would be much easier if other languages were like Latin and Greek, which make a distinction between you singular and you plural. Most of the languages, so-called Indo-European branch of language, do not do that. And it's, for instance, I've been wrestling with some kind of way to bring that out. Now, I'm tempted to say you all sometimes, but
We would understand.
English used to have that with thou and thee.
Yes.
And you was the plural.
yeah, and but that would not get over. I'm toying with an idea of something like this: you collectively, and that would get over the idea that you don't know how many times I have to wrestle with these things. Every single word requires about 10 to 15 decisions. It keeps you on your toes.
Isn't that like the word men and man, which actually incorporated both genders?
Yeah, Well, yes, but I don't see the parallel exactly.
Well, that, I mean, you're talking about groups
Yeah.
of people.
Oh, okay.
And I'm talking in the singular mind.
Yeah. See, there's two words for man in Hebrew. I mean in Greek. Aner is male, and anthropos is mankind.
So we're
and-
the ones that have one word for.
So, but there, guess what? Aner means husband also. And I'm coming up to a place where that's going to make a difference in when it talks about women keep silent in the churches.
Oh, is it in our favor?
Huh?
Because I may take issue.
Well, I don't think that's women in general. The way I'm going to translate it is, that's the wives of prophets. Because you know they're married, because they say, ask their husbands at home. You don't usually hear that when that passage is quoted. It doesn't tell you what to do it doesn't tell you what to do if they don't know the answer either. We'll get that. Okay, let's get back here. You are not ignorant, are you, of the place in Elijah? Now here's one of those rhetorical questions that should be answered. I'm not ignorant, I know. You're not ignorant, are you, of the place in Elijah where he is pleading with God against his own people. This is one of the most interesting passages in the Old Testament. Elijah has just beat the socks off of the priests of Baal. And he had this, that when he did that, there was going to be a mass repentance. And Israel, the northern tribe, was going to go back to God and all. So what happened? It didn't change anybody's mind.
Especially Jezebel's.
This is it's a paradigm for why many people get frustrated with God, because they expect him to do something he hasn't promised to do. And when he doesn't, you're just like frustrated children. Well, I don't love you, Mother, just because they didn't get what they wanted. So this is Elijah. He didn't get the results he wanted. So he goes out, way out in the desert, away from everybody, and he throws himself a private pity party. And you talk about, this is almost the best example of a pity party you'll ever see. And he says, Lord, they have killed your prophets and destroyed your altars. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. I'm the only faithful person left. Now,
Yeah.
you know, the reason we're laughing is that we recognize some of that in each one of us. But what does the divine utterance say? Now, that was a very hard thing to translate, because it doesn't say voice, it divine oracle, but who knows what an oracle is today? And it just means a divine statement. That's the reason utterance. But it's spoken. See, you can write a statement, but utterance is, now, it probably represents what the Jewish rabbis called the Bath Kol. and that means the daughter voice.
Well, what was that phrase again? The bath? What was the last?
Coal.
word? Coal?
Yeah.
What does daughter voice mean?
Well, if you wait, I'll tell you.
Oh,
It is, there's several places in the Old Testament, even there's a couple in the New Testament, where God's voice comes down out of heaven. Can you remember? At the baptism?
And I'm well pleased.
Moses on the burning bush.
Yeah, but that's in the Old Testament. In the, what?
Mount of Transfiguration.
Well, there's three. I'd forgotten that one. The other one is when a group of Jewish-speaking Christians came to Philip and wanted Philip to introduce them to Jesus. And Jesus has been saying something. It's in the Gospel of John. He said, glorify the Son. And the voice came down and said, I have glorified it and I will glorify it. And somebody said, it thundered.
Oh, yeah, they didn't hear the voice, they just heard the thunder.
What?
They didn't hear the voice, they just heard thunder.
Yeah, okay. That is the daughter voice.
When Saul was converted,
That term.
What?
when Saul was converted, I mean,
The road to Damascus.
yeah, didn't Jesus?
Well, now, that was Jesus himself.
Oh, you're talking about God.
Oh, okay.
And that wasn't a voice from heaven. Jesus appeared. Paul always insisted he had seen the.
Just a voice.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. That's what's meant here. And if I put down the daughter voice, it wouldn't have meant a thing. But that.
Why the term daughter voice?
Yeah, I guess that was my question. Where do you get the name daughter voice?
Not being a Talmudic scholar, I don't have a clue.
Okay, so that comes from the Jewish tradition. They named it.
Yes. Yes.
But we don't know why.
I don't have a clue.
Okay.
It could have been.
Yeah.
I'm sure that part of it was involved in the fact that the Jews would not utter the name of God because they were afraid they would be blaspheming. So the reason Matthew doesn't talk about the kingdom of God, he talks about the kingdom. By the way, every place it's the kingdom of the heavens, plural. And there's not an English translation on the face of the earth.
That's yours.
Except mine.
Kingdom of the heavens.
Uh-huh. He's not talking about heaven, where we think we're going to go after we die.
He's talking about the universe?
No, he's just talking about the sky, the heavens. What do we mean when we say the heavens?
Space. The kingdom of
Yeah.
kingdom of space.
Well,
Captain Kirk.
so, okay. Mike, this is what gets in the way about Edward's talk, is that it's hard to break people away from the idea of going to heaven. As best I know, nobody's going to go to heaven. We're going to be on a new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. And I saw the heavenly Jerusalem coming down
To us.
and coming to us. God always takes the initiative.
But God is residing in heaven currently. There is a heaven, right?
Oh,
We saw the movie, Heaven is for Kids.
actually, no.
Oh, no.
God is, he transcends. He's outside of space and time.
So all those images of him being on a throne with the angels worshiping is just for us to be able to kind of.
Those are symbolic. Okay. Now,
Moving along.
they represent something real, but not a person alive could know exactly what they represent, except they're drawing on the idea of a king surrounded by his counselors, and that's God as king on his throne. Okay.
The best John could come up with.
What?
The best description John could come up with.
Yes, it is. Okay. I'm left alone, and you're seeking my life. But what does the divine utterance say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who've never bowed their knees to Baal. Now, Elijah wasn't very wrong. Just 7,000 to 1. That's supposed to be a little funny.
Is that number different in other passages? It seems like I always thought it was 5,000.
No, it's
More
7,000.
than 7,000.
Yes. And see, that's one of the best things that I know of, one of the best antidotes for what I call a pity party. It's easy for people that are hurt by believers. It's easy for people that have undergoing all kinds of stresses and strains from fellow believers to think they're the only one left. Well, I've never gotten quite that low. I always include my family. But it's something to think about. God never leaves himself without a remnant, the righteous remnant. Any of you very knowledgeable about the Old Testament will know the phrase, the righteous remnant. And even when the nation was being destroyed and all of the leaders and everything were being transported to Babylon, there were faithful remnant of Jews. Now, Paul keeps that in mind. And if you don't keep it in mind, you will miss what he's saying here.
Is this perhaps what is alluded to by the 144,000 in Revelation?
It's possible, but you cannot make the connection. All right. In the same way, at the present time, there is a faithful remnant chosen by grace. Now, notice, this is a remnant of whom? What? Jews. There was a good number of Jewish believers. Now, don't know how many, but several thousands anyway. Now, they didn't have it easy, folks. It was bad enough on Gentile believers. But the Jewish believers in the Messiah, by this time, had very little place to go. They were being systematically excluded from the synagogues. They weren't completely excluded in every place in the Roman Empire until after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And after then, they were completely excluded from the synagogue. And besides that, in 90 AD, at the Council of Jamnia, the basically Pharisaical party, because due to historical events, nearly all the other Jewish sectarian groups, like the Sadducees, the Qumran community, the the Zealots, other groups like that, the Herodians, they were just about wiped off the face of the earth. And so by default, Judaism persisted in the Pharisaical side. And they wrote into the liturgy of the synagogue the so-called 12 anathemas. And they do not mention Christian belief or Christians by name, but they describe what Christians believe, and they anathematize that. And so after 70, the Jewish believers really, there were a lot of number of Gentile believers that didn't want them either. So it was rough. And Paul is writing this to a church that was located in the Roman capital, where the Jews 25, 30 years before had been excluded and exiled. You remember Priscilla and Aquila that Paul met in Ephesus. The reason they were there was that Claudius had issued a decree for the Jews to leave Rome. And it was several years after his death before any came back. Now that's the background. The Roman church could have had a lot of people that were pretty basically anti-Semitic in it. And this is written, now, while this is talking about Jews, it's written directly to Gentiles. So listen, it's written to you and me.
What does anathetize mean?
Excommunicated, thrown out. It means what?
Anathematize?
An anathema is a curse. And it means you're cursed, get away. Okay. In the same way, at the present time, there is a faithful remnant, but Paul wants it understood, chosen by grace. And if it is by grace, it is no longer by works, or else grace would no longer be grace. Now, Paul is going to insist that all people who are saved in the present time, in the present age, will be saved the same way. Now, this is very important because there's all kinds of theories running around in Christian circles today about what God is going to do with the Jews as Jews. And I thought when I translated this, I would find out what it was. What I find out from here, and Mike from studying N.T. Wright, is that Paul says there's no longer any difference between Jew and Gentile. That you must, everyone, Jew and Gentile, accept Jesus as the promised Messiah, the Son of God. And did somebody say something over here? Oh. It happens to the best of us, WT. Okay. All right. Keep that in mind. And that's what Paul is saying here. That the righteous remnant of the Jews were selected by grace, saved through their faith. Everybody is alike.
These are the Jewish believers.
What?
These are the Jewish believers.
Yes, in Christ.
Isn't it almost like the opposite of what happened to Ruth and Rahab? They, as a minority in a sense, were brought in to Jewish people. Now it's almost the other way around.
Well,
the smaller group of now Messianic Jews, to put it in any other term, are now becoming part of to the overall people of God.
well, here is the thing. there is only one people of God.
Right.
And there has always been only one people of God. Now, but God hasn't repudiated the Jews. Even though he had a lot of judgment upon them, and even though they didn't accomplish his
He
purposes,
almost did that with Moses.
yes, God does not repudiate people. He's in the business of, as Paul said, I am all things to all men whereby I may save some. And that doesn't mean that he gets immoral or anything like that. He comes alongside of them and looks at the world from their viewpoint. And
Brother Charles, I think a moment ago you said something like Paul is now saying there is no longer any difference between Jews and Gentiles.
yes,
Where are you taking that from? Is that in this passage?
no,
Okay,
there's other places.
okay.
I may get to some of them later on, but
The
we've
reason I ask, there's a very large church here in town that has a minister that is very big in talking about America's responsibility to protect the nation of Israel, and he is teaching a lot about that. And I think you know who I'm talking about. But anyway, in the Bible study that I'm in my neighborhood, that is a conversation that bubbles up from time to time, and so would love to kind of know that passage if you have it at hand.
Okay. I'll try to get you some material.
Okay, thank you.
And because it is just nothing but human speculation.
Yeah.
Okay. We go on. What then does this mean? It means that which Israel has been seeking, they have not received. That is, they had been seeking salvation based on the Torah. Now, not keeping it legalistically. That's what we Gentiles began. But they were they were using it. We are the people of God. We have the temple, or we had the temple. We have the law. It's what N.T. Wright calls ethnicity. We are right with God because the covenant was made with Abraham, and we are in the covenant. But they missed the second half of the promise and the responsibility. Abraham said, God told him, make a great nation of them. And they accepted that, and we're the great nation. But he also says that all the nations in the world will be blessed by your descendants, Abraham. And Paul really makes that clear in his teaching, that the Jews were happy enough to accept the privileges of being chosen, but they weren't as strong on the responsibilities. Now, folks, that describes many Christian believers today. I hate to say that, but it's true. Because we are chosen, and we can get what N.T. Wright calls triumphalist. We're more than conquerors through him who loved us. I'm better than you are.
Look what we are doing.
Look what I am.
And then we're Texans on top of that.
Oh boy. Yep.
Pinnacle of humanity.
What?
The pinnacle of humanity.
Yes. See, and that there's no room for triumphalism. Remember, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. He's the person that invented theology. He is the person through whom you and I came to know Christ, because most of us have roots in Europe eventually.
So the opposite of that would be there, but for the grace of God go I.
Yeah, and really mean it.
Yeah.
Yes. See, that's one of those things that we say that we don't really mean
Yeah,
sometimes. Okay. Yes. And that's this passage, while it, as I said, it's talking about Jews. It's directed at Gentiles, as you will see. It means that Israel, what Israel has been seeking, they have not received. But the remnant and the rest are being hardened by God. Now, here we come to the very difficult concept of God hardening. Now, we could spend the rest of our lives and still wouldn't get everything out of that. Take it as it is written, that the Jews had behaved in a way that caused their hearts to be hard. And how God did that, whether He did it on the basis of their rejection, you can make all kinds of arguments, but until you talk to God face to face, you're not going to know exactly what that means.
I guess by the time we get to talk to God face to face, we probably won't worry.
Yeah, that's right. Probably so. I quit worrying about it a long time ago.
I get the feeling from that phrase of being hardened by God as think of an individual who rejects Christ, rejects God. You're talking to them and they reject it. The more you expose that to them, then the harder they get, the madder they get, the more, it's almost like they just get more and more and more stubborn and hardened in their
Yes.
disbelief. Not that you want them to get that way, it's not that God's making them that way, it's just that they get harder and harder and harder as they choose to shut down.
That's included in it. It's not everybody, but that's hardened. But there's yes.
I think of this parable of the sower, where the seed fell on the hardened path.
Mhm.
And I get beat, but even once it rains, they can accept that seed. Once a crisis comes, even a person like that can have this word of God enter them.
Okay, here's the thing. Paul is talking historically here because he saw the hardness of many Jewish hearts. You remember when we studied Acts together? He would go to a new place and he would be greatly successful until the Jews came from the previous place. See, he's describing an experience.
What was it, a personal experience? Wouldn't he have a heart like that himself before he was converted?
Yes. Yes.
So he knew what he was talking about.
Yes. By the way, most people think that Paul was a follower of Gamaliel, who was his teacher. But I noticed N.T. Wright, by the way, I keep quoting him because he has done more exegetical study, that is, the meaning of the text, than any other person I've ever run across. He is, if there's an expert in Pauline theology, he is it. And he points out that Paul was probably a follower of Shammai, who was much harder, because Paul himself said, I was of the strictest sect of our religion. And that is the way that Shemites usually describe themselves.
In other words, he wouldn't have said to the Sanhedrin what he did, what Gamaliel said, if this is of God, then you better leave it alone.
Yeah. No, he was of the ones that, I'm not going to leave it alone, I'm going to kill him.
Yeah, exactly. So that makes him, maybe he says that he wasn't
Yes. Now, I haven't studied it that much, but what he says makes good sense.
That was an amazing transformation.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
Just as it is written, God has given them a spirit of slumber, eyes that cannot see, and ears that cannot hear. Now, there is this little time phrase, until now.
Yeah.
Now, there might be a little hope in that. Because, notice, it's got a time limit. Now, I'm not sure
NIV says to this very day.
to this very day.
It's a totally different meaning.
Yeah, well, actually, it doesn't have a totally different meaning.
Because that sounds very final. Like
Yeah,
there's no-
well,
there's no-
Well, but there's going to be another day. Could be. Okay. King David also says, let their feasting tables become a trap and a snare and a cause of stumbling and falling for them. This is a just payback for their behavior. May their eyes become darkened so they cannot see, and may their backs be constantly bent by the burdens they carry. Now, this is again a historical description. This is in the Psalms. And it says, the idea is you cannot see what you don't want to see. You cannot hear what you don't want to hear. If you'd have had in many couples in counseling, as I have had experienced, you would know that this is extremely true about people. That the great problem between married couples is that they don't hear each other. They could quote the words. The Jews could do that, but they don't listen. They don't. To listen means to perceive, to understand, to be open to what is being said. Okay. I asked therefore. Therefore is the retrospective conjunction. In the light of this, Paul is going on. Now notice, this is a tight-knit argument based on Old Testament scriptures applied to the Jews. And I see that we're going to put